Welcome to episode 8 of the Iron John podcast, which is a production of the Minnesota Men's Conference. In this episode, we get to talk to poet, scholar, mythologist, and author Robert Bringhurst, who will be one of the presenters at the 2024 Fall Minnesota Men's Conference. Robert's work is a vast and amazing study of Haida oral literature, including 2 volumes of translation of the works of the Haida mythtellers Ghandl and Skaay, and also a marvelous book titled Story as Sharp as a Knife. Interviewing Robert today are Ben Dennis, Miguel Rivera, Timothy Young, and yours truly, Walton Stanley. I hope you enjoy the podcast.
Welcome, everybody. We're introducing Robert Bringhurst, who will be with us this fall in Minnesota Men's Conference. Robert is one of Canada's most respected poets, a topographer, translator, cultural historian, and linguist, lifelong student of Native American languages and literatures, and he has a strong interest in translating works on classical Greek, Arabic, Navajo, significantly Haida. 3 particular works are translations of Ghandl and Skaay, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, and an introductory volume titled A Story as Sharp as a Knife, which I will personally recommend anybody that's interested in this subject. So welcome, Robert. Really happy to have you here.
Thanks, Ben. It's very nice to be here.
So the first thing that comes to my mind when reading through your material is this relationship between the oral tradition and the living community that we have right now. You write a lot about the living nature of story, literature, oral traditions, and how they live within our imaginations, within our cultures. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
Well, we live in a world where humans do an awful lot of manipulating, and we have built up a very impressive body of science that treats almost everything as if it were dead, that preserves specimens in museums, and is very good at measuring and weighing things and analyzing things. But the world is alive, and all pre-industrial cultures understood that they were living in a world in which everything was alive. The rocks were alive as well as the trees. One of the favorite expressions of the old Haida storytellers is, "I can't do that. The ground might see me. The earth might see me if I did that, if I did something that I shouldn't do." People understood themselves to be living in a world that was made of nothing but living things. Nothing was dead. Well, that kind of thinking is out of fashion right now, but anybody who has any experience in the storytelling world knows that stories are alive. Anybody with any experience of human language, which includes every human old enough to talk, knows that languages are alive. They're not dead. They're not static. And in fact, they're fantastically, wonderfully complex organisms. So it just makes a lot of sense to me to admit that the study of linguistics is part of biology. It's part of the study of living things. Human languages only live where there are human beings for them to live with. We have a kind of commensal or a symbiotic relationship with languages and with stories, and that just makes things more interesting and more complex.
I love that. I've had one of my thoughts when I started storytelling all those years ago with Walton and others was that the stories themselves were living beings whose environment was the hearts and minds and the imaginations and the voices and the ears of the people who were there to listen to. And you add a whole nother layer that it also includes all of the livingness all around us, including the ground and the sky and the plants and the animals and everything. So I really deeply appreciate the way that you look at that. So given that we are moving toward a conference where we will gather to tell stories, among other things, how do you see the role of storytelling and the oral, you use a phrase, not just oral traditions, but oral literature. And I wanted, we have this idea in the West that literature is only written language, pen to paper and the printer and so on. But you elaborate very eloquently this idea that literature is, I would say, originally oral. Can you speak to that as well as the role that this oral literature has for us today?
Yeah, well, writing is wonderful stuff, and it's very sophisticated technology, and we've done a lot with it in the last 2 or 3,000 years, but that's not very long in terms of the history of the world, or even in terms of the history of the human species. Humans have been around for a couple of 100,000 years. So if we've only been writing and reading in the literal sense, making little marks on rocks or shells or slabs of wood or pieces of paper, if we've only been doing that for the last 2 or 3 or 4,000 years, that's a tiny fraction of the lifetime of the species. And if you're a serious student of literature, you read back in time as far as you can go. You read German back to the songs of the Nibelungenlied, and French back to the Roman de la Rose and the other early romances, and English back to Beowulf and the Seafarer, and Greek back to the Iliad and the Odyssey. The early things always turn out to be oral literature that got written down. That is, the books, the great works, were stories that professional or non-professional storytellers told, oral poets in many cases. And when writing was introduced to a society, then it became possible to transcribe, to write down what those storytellers or oral poets were saying. A lot of people will say there weren't any books until there was writing, because there wasn't any way to make a book. But then, what was the Iliad? What was the Odyssey before it was written down? If it became a book when you wrote it down, what was it before that happened? It was an oral book, wasn't it? It was a book that you couldn't put in your pocket, but you could put it in your mind. Instead of going to the library and taking it off a shelf, you went to an old person and said, "Would you tell me that story?" Or you went to a place where the story was going to be told because it was part of some festival, or because that's what we do when the sun goes down, because we don't have television. We tell stories. So I just think that it makes sense. And if you've ever been in an oral culture, that's getting hard to do nowadays, but if you've been in an oral culture, a world where writing just isn't used, although it might exist, you see that people do have literature. They have songs, they have long stories that take days or weeks to tell. They have proverbs and sayings that they quote from the storytellers, or they quote pieces of wisdom, and they make reference to the stories by just saying, what about what so-and-so did in such a place? People understand these things in literary terms, that is, by reference to a body of stories that the community share.
Excellent. Walton, you got a question?
Yeah, I was just going to follow up a little bit in that same vein. We've been at the men's conference, we've been working with stories and folk tales that in most cases seem to be coming from a somewhat broken oral tradition. That is, we have the records of somebody like the Grimm brothers, who were essentially doing kind of anthropological or ethnological research and wrote these things down from storytellers. But a lot of those stories are also kind of infused with kind of a Christian moralistic values and imagery and things that seem to have been added into much older oral tales. And I'm wondering, in your work with transcriptions of Haida bardic poets, Ghandl and Skaay, that you've sort of accessed an essentially, largely, I'd say more intact anyway, oral tradition. And can you address any insights you have on intact oral tradition and literature versus a kind of broken line of oral storytelling? And secondly, do you think such a broken line might ever be restored through people going back and re-engaging with those stories in the form they find them?
Well, if it makes sense, as I claim, to treat these things as living things, living creatures, then, the brokenness is just part of life. You break your leg, you take care of it, and it'll heal. You chop it off, you've lost it for good. Both these things happen to oral traditions. They suffer irreparable damage, and they suffer lesser kinds of damage. But if they're alive, then they're constantly at risk. They're interacting with their surroundings, and they're going to get injured just as we all do. That's part of the evidence that they are alive. Of course, the world we live in right now is one in which an awful lot of damage is being done to an awful lot of people and an awful lot of things. Being done, in many cases, very rapidly and very violently. So it's easy to fear that everything is being lost. Well, maybe everything is being lost, but that doesn't mean that everything is gone quite yet. So we do what we can. There, as far as the translation of traditions from oral to written form, which makes it possible for them to travel around the world more quickly than they could in oral form. There's no purity. Once writing is introduced, people start to travel from one place to another. You can't go anywhere without affecting what happens in the place that you've arrived. You might be the perfect anthropologist who, doesn't have any expectations, doesn't make any demands, just sits there and listens. But just by the fact that you're there, you're changing the way people see things. You change their environment just by being there. John Swanton, who is responsible for basically for all the Haida oral literature that we have preserved in written form, was in the Haida country for a year, from September 1900 to August 1901. A year is a long time in the field for an anthropologist. Often people just go for a summer, or they go for a few weeks, and maybe they go back year after year, but they don't stay in the place for a year typically. And Swanton did that. And also he was a very quiet, reserved man who was a really good listener. And as much as anybody can, he did, I think, manage to kind of disappear into the woodwork and just let people do what they did and say what they wanted to say. But of course, people were suspicious of him at first, and some people saw him as an employment opportunity or something. But he was pretty good at dodging that kind of thing, and he made some real friends. People learned to trust him, and he listened well, and he wrote thousands of pages of Haida literature. And he didn't say, well, these are dumb people who don't even know how to read and write, and I'm going to fix what they tell me. I'm going to improve it. The Grimm brothers did an awful lot of improving, and by improving their material, they, in some respects, ruined it. Swanton had been trained better than that, and he didn't make those kinds of mistaken repairs. So he's a good model. He was there at a moment when Haida culture was intact enough that the storytellers could still tell him the stories that they did. If he'd come 20 years later, those people would have been dead, and their successors would not have been capable of telling stories in the same way that Swanton heard them. If he'd come 100 years earlier, well, the resources available to him would have been much richer. But 100 years earlier, nobody was doing this on the northwest coast of North America. So it didn't happen. If he'd come there 1,000 years earlier, well, we don't know, but that would be wonderful to find out. You just have to, you get what you get. You have to live with it. And in the Haida case and many other cases, the riches that we've got, however little, are still huge. They're stupendous.
Exactly. Miguel, you had a question?
Oh, yeah. Greetings to everybody, and greetings to you, Robert. It's nice to spend time with you again after all these years. I remember when I first started reading your book, The Story as Sharp as a Knife, I had this impression that these stories, the way they were transmitted to Swanton and the way they were taken care of, they're like these packets of seeds of cultural important information that's basically they've been dormant until there's interest. Like us now, all of a sudden are finding these treasures, and it's like we're finally getting to water a seed. In the early 1980s, I got the opportunity to spend time with a Paiute medicine man. If they knew they were going to get hammered because of the ghost dance. And so his name was Raymond Stone. And his great-grandfather was also a medicine man. And what he said, everything that we are comes from the land. If we ever lose it, and he said our culture, our stories, the way we make houses, the way we tell jokes, pottery, skirts, everything comes from the land. If we ever lose it, we go back to the land and the land will tell us. And I think that the stories and the way they are appearing right now, at least in the way that you've worked at bringing them out and sharing them with everybody, I feel like we're finally getting tuned to listening to the voice of the land, no matter where we are, because we've been so disconnected from participating as humans, as other beings that are part of this larger web of life. And I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to go into depth with this in these crazy critical times, because maybe that is the answer, is to stop and listen to what the voice of the land is, which to me these stories carry in a really beautiful, eloquent way. So that's basically what was coursing through my mind, at the moment.
Well, a lot of land has been destroyed, of course, but land can grow back. Land can restore itself. It can heal itself if you don't destroy it completely. When you first put asphalt over the top of it, it looks like, it's gone for good. But asphalt doesn't last forever. Healing is possible. The ground, the earth, is the great memory bank. That's where people store their knowledge, where they store their stories. Go back to a place that you haven't been for 20 years, and all kinds of things come back into your mind. The stories that you heard there, people that you knew there, things that you thought, maybe songs that you heard that you've long since forgotten. They come back out, as it were, out of the ground, because the mind and the ground fit together. I think a lot of storytelling is like rock climbing. Rock climbing is sold nowadays as some kind of entertainment, something to do when you're on vacation. But for a real rock climber, rock climbing is a serious business. And you do it by fastening your mind onto the rock. And you stay fastened to it until you get off, because otherwise you fall. You fasten your mind onto the ground, and the ground fastens onto your mind somehow.
Beautiful. Tim?
Robert, following up on that the statement by Miguel, I just went back and looked at my notes that I wrote down to phrases from your tree of meaning. And there was a phrase or a sentence that goes, does the tree of ineffability grow in the soil of language? I do not claim to know, but without language, could we know of ineffability? I was just wondering, is there a veil of some sort in your mind between the ineffable and the physical in this through language, or is language the veil between the ineffable and the physical?
That's a wonderful question, Gemma. I'm not going to pretend to answer it.
Okay.
But anybody who works with language as you do knows that it's an imperfect tool, and those of us using it are imperfect workmen. We do what we can, but sometimes I feel like I'm practicing archaeology, and I'm down there in the dust with my little brush and my little tiny shovel, and I'm moving grains of sand out of the way, and it all feels like just I'm working on an incredibly tiny scale, and nevertheless I discover things that have existed for thousands of years, and there they are. They're coming back to life before my eyes. The language makes it possible to do some of that. It doesn't restore the ancient world in all its glory and technicolor and so forth, but it makes some things possible.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to follow up on that. And I was reading about language in that latest essay, or the preface for the forthcoming book. And I got the sense that you consider language to be as an organism. And I would ask, do you also consider imagination to be an organism?
Well, I consider pretty much everything to be an organism until proven to be something else.
I like it.
But, I mean, it's very instructive to try to compare the imagination with the language. We know that language has a grammar and a vocabulary, right? Do we know that about the imagination? Well, probably it has a grammar and probably it has a vocabulary, but where's the dictionary? Where's the grammar book? It's a little bit out of reach, and nevertheless, we depend upon it 24 hours a day, dreaming and waking.
That's beautiful. Walton?
In that regard, as regarding language, something you mentioned in a story as sharp as a knife, I believe it was, you were talking about Haida being more of a verb-centered language than English, which is very noun-centered. So in English, we like to very much name objects or objectify things with the language. And of course, I think, language changes our conceptual framework. And I'm wondering if you've noticed any difference in verb-centered or less noun-centered languages than English in how people relate to the world around them or conceive the world around them simply because of the structure of the language, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I don't think it's a question I can answer. It's a psychological question, and the psychology is very interesting to me, but that's That's not my area of expertise. I'm more struck by the difference between individual human beings than I am by the differences between speakers of one language and speakers of another. I don't find that I get very far if I try to tell myself that all English speakers think this way or act this way or eat this kind of food. It turns out not to be true. Or all Haida speakers or Cree speakers or whatever it is. Wherever you go, there are a whole bunch of different people doing different things, and sure they have a lot in common, but it's what they don't have in common that makes it possible to see these commonalities. And the humans are wonderfully complicated organisms, and I love reading about the fact that we think of ourselves as single individuals, but you and I have got 10 or 20,000 other species living in our guts and living in our mouths and living in our skin, and without all those additional characters whose names we don't know, mostly in Latin or any other language, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't stay alive for 24 hours. Another example of the fact that you can't get complete purity, right? You can't really isolate the human being from all the other living things, and you can't isolate the tree from the ground or from the air or from the other things that live with it, the fungi and the soil on which it depends, the bird from the tree from the bird that might distribute the seeds. These interconnections are mind-blowing, and that's what's wonderful about them.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful, beautiful. This kind of leads me right to the next subject that I wanted to touch base on. And well, just to give you a little bit of an overview of where I'm thinking of going is I want you to discuss, I'm inviting you to talk a little bit about myth as distinct from, stories. You said someplace that myths are bigger than human beings and that they rise up. And so there's a little bit of a distinction in my mind about what's mythic and what's just in the oral traditions. The next place I wanted to go is talk about translation before we get to poetry. But is there something you could speak to about myth, about this nature of myth? You write in Everywhere Being is Dancing on your essay about mythology. Mythology is an ecosystem of myths and a functioning community of stories. And so it seems to me that it's something larger than, points to something much bigger that we don't talk about much in our modern society.
Yes. Well, myth is just mythos, is just the Greek word for story. But for us, it's become a word that gets used in a lot of different ways. A neighbor of mine was telling me that such and such a thing was a myth just the other day, and what he meant was it's not true. It didn't happen the way they say it. That's one way of using the word. But when Socrates wants to talk to his friends about what happens when you introduce writing into a culture, he tells a story, a myth, an Egyptian myth, as it turns out, about what happened when the Egyptian god Thoth introduced writing. It ruined people's memories, according to this myth. Well, there's an old Greek writer called Sallustios who lived late in the Greek world when the Romans were in control. He wrote a little book about mythology. He says these stories never happened, but they always are. Tauta de genito men udepote esti deae. They are for always. That's the meaning of myth that's interesting to me, these stories that tell you something that never expires, something that always has a meaning, even if the meaning changes. Those kinds of stories never exist in isolation. They're always part of an ecosystem, a population of myths, and so they inform each other and they connect together like trees in the forest. You can tell one tree from another, but if you try to dig it up, you'll discover that its roots are intertwined with the roots of the tree next to it, and they're intertwined with the fungi in the soil without which the tree couldn't eat. Those fabrics, those felts of stories are the places where, all kinds of things hang out, little creatures, little bits of information, little fragments of story, little pieces of the truth. So you go and wrap yourself up in these stories, you get dirty, you also get nourished. You find out that you come away knowing more than you did before, even if you can't quite explain it to anybody else, because it doesn't translate very easily into non-mythic language, into analytical language.
Yeah, that's beautiful. In that same article you write, but a myth is not exactly a work of literature. It is instead a kind of story which a literary work can only partially embody or contain. I love that because it invites that understanding that when we go into the mythic, we're never going to get fully to the bottom of the roots of it. I think that's an amazing lifelong endeavor to dive there. Shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to see what you had to say about translation and the role of translation. As storytellers, as Walton alluded to earlier, we go digging wherever we can find the stories, we find them, whether they're Grimm's or whether they're some ethnological piece, we go diving for them. So we are looking for, how do we translate these stories? How do we bring them forward? And you as a translator, that's part of what you do. So can you speak to what that process is about and how we as storytellers can engage with that?
Well, translation is a word like myth. It has a lot of different meanings, and it's not hard to get them confused. The kind of translation that I do is quite literally translation. We often talk about translating word for word, but that's almost never possible. Languages are different enough from one another that you can't usually make sense by translating one word and then the next word and then the next word. But you can certainly translate sentence by sentence. The way we got the Iliad and the Odyssey, or the way we got the stories of Ghandl and Skaay, the great Haida storytellers of the late 19th century. If you have that kind of record of a story, then you have something really precious. There it is in a language that maybe not very many people can read. So you want to translate it into a language that's more widely shared. You do this sentence by sentence, leaving nothing out and putting nothing in. That's translation in the hard technical sense. It goes on every day at the United Nations, in NATO meetings and so on, and it goes on every day in the libraries of the world, where people are toiling over old books. And sometimes you're translating a book that's been translated many times before. People are always publishing new translations of the Greek classics and the Latin classics and the great Russian novels and so on. But if you have something like these Haida stories, you have an author who deserves to be famous but is unknown outside his home community. You have to learn to hear his voice well enough that you can try to recreate that voice in an entirely different language. And English is really very different from Haida and vice versa. Well, you can do this. It's slow work, but it's entirely feasible. That's quite different from translating a story from one storyteller's voice into another storyteller's voice, where everything's going to change, where you're not going maybe to repeat any sentences, you're going to re-envision the whole story. But in both cases, you have to learn to understand what's happening in the story and see the whole shape of it so that you can recreate it. It's like playing music. You can't play a piece of music well if you just play one note and then the next note and then the next note and have no conception of how these notes fit together. But if you see and feel the whole piece, then you can play it, and you can even make mistakes as you go, and the music can still be intelligible, even enjoyable. Real storytelling is this kind of work. A person hears a story, and then a week or a month or a year or 10 years later, they want to tell it, and they're not going to repeat it verbatim the way they heard it. They're going to recreate it in their own voice, and with whatever changes are suggested by the circumstances in which they're telling the story. But to do that, you have to have really heard it and maybe thought about it for 10 years before you tell it again, or at least thought about it long enough to have this, to be able to give yourself to the story, so that the story can give itself to you.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Walton, you have a question?
Yes, Robert, I was just wondering in that regard, since we were talking about translating the Haida stories, what was the genesis of that project for you? When did you become aware of those stories? And one might say, what possessed you to write such a monumental work of translation and explanation of those particular stories? I'm guessing it wasn't popular demand.
It was not popular demand. You're absolutely right. I was born in Southern California. I was raised in Montana and Wyoming and Utah and southern Alberta. And I went to school in Massachusetts. And then I was in the Middle East for a while and in Europe for a while. And then I came back to North America, and I came to Vancouver, southern British Columbia, to go to graduate school. And I really liked the place. And I thought, I'm probably going to stick around here, not in this city, but in this neck of the woods, this part of the land. And I really didn't know where I was because I hadn't grown up on the Northwest coast. So, the forest was full of plants that I didn't really recognize. There were animals that I didn't know. And of course, there were indigenous traditions that I knew essentially nothing about. So I'm an avid hiker. I used to be a climber. I'm too old to do that now, but I wasn't too old to do it then. So, I'm accustomed to the idea that you get a field guide and you go out into the forest with it, and when you see a plant you don't recognize, you sit down and look it up, key it out to try to figure out exactly what it is, or at least approximately what it is. And I did a lot of that, and I learned my way around the environment where I was. And I also went to the library and read ethnography. Read about the Salish and the Haida and the Tsimshian and the other peoples of the Northwest coast here. And this was all a revelation to me. And what I was most attracted to were the books of oral literature in the coastal languages, Haida and Kwakwala in particular, Tsimshian, Niska. These were published, most of them, by the Bureau of American Ethnology, an outfit in Washington, D.C., that happily sent researchers into Canada and Mexico, as well as all across the United States. Did this in the latter half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th. These ethnographers went out and did whatever they could do. Some of them were really gifted and serious researchers, and some not so gifted and not so serious. The Smithsonian Institution used to be the place where their papers were all stored. It's all been moved out to a place in Maryland now, but it's still there, this giant archive. And a lot of their work was published. Swanton's Haida work was published in English, some of it in Haida, not very much. But all the Haida texts were still available, and they were in a library in Philadelphia, the American Philosophical Society library. So it took me a while to get these basic facts straight, but it was Swanton's English translations of the Haida stories that I fell in love with. And initially I thought, boy, this is great stuff. I'm going to make some poetry out of this. And as I read a little further, I thought, you dumbass, this is poetry. You don't have to make it into poetry. What you have to do is learn to see it for what it is. Well, if it's that good, and it was, and it is, then, you have to learn the language in order to really appreciate it, really understand it. It was just like reading a translation of some French or German poet and saying, wow, well, this is great. I'm going to go and look up the original. I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to learn enough French or enough German to get my way through the original. So that's what I did. I went to the library in Philadelphia. I got copies of all Swanton's Haida texts, and I sat down with him, and I made my own dictionary, and I wrote my own grammar. And after 10 or 15 years, I could do something with these stories. And so that's the way it was. If I'd known what I was getting myself into in the beginning, I might have been terrified and said, no, that's too hard. I'll go and do something else. But it was just one step after another, and every step was rewarding, and I've never spent an hour with those stories that I didn't feel that I had been hugely rewarded for all the time that I'd spent. It just, they're magnificent pieces of work.
I really appreciate that, which leads me right to the next part of what I was interested in hearing from you about is poetry. Obviously, you're recognized as a substantial poet. So is there anything, obviously this work with the Haida literature has been significantly influenced both ways. So can you speak to that some?
Or
if you have a poem you can read to us, that would be wonderful too.
That's sure. Let's do that, because reading a poem is a whole lot easier than trying to say something about poetry. Okay, here's a short poem called You Who Do Not. Dead trees standing on the long point, slow as wooden lightning in the blue sky, showing how it goes. These ordinary bones would never look that good strung up against the air. I should be glad, though, for anyone to see them gnawed and scattered on the scuffed earth. Brittle plants and animals leave messages that say, without a word, it is a decent, honest, useful thing to die, and we all do it, often badly. You who do not wish to hear this needn't hear it, yet my guess is you will say it with the best when just your teeth and bones remain to do the talking. Dying does, of course, in any case, go on until the living ceases. After that, the protons and electrons and the rest go right on dreaming, talking, working, as they have for what we like to think of as so long. When you are dead, you are continuous with everything that is and was and will be. It is only in the moment you're alive that you can toy with turning crosswise, being not what being is, but what it isn't, being other than the earth is, other than the wood is, other than your long last word will testify you are.
I was just looking at Robert's preface here again, and while I was listening, I came upon his line, culture is always under construction and always rotting away. And I'd like to think that that's what we're doing every minute of our lives, not just as a culture, but as individuals. What I appreciate about that poem is that it is both personal and universal at the same time. So I thank you for that, Robert.
Well, thank you. What you said about culture brings us back to where we started, doesn't it?
Yep.
What Walton said at the very beginning. Things are always falling apart, but that's not to say that that's the only thing that's happening. It may be the most visible thing, the most obvious thing, especially when the bombs are falling or the missiles are landing, but other things are happening too.
Miguel?
And one of the things in this introduction that we keep referring to, which you so generously shared with us, is the fact that we don't participate in the cycles of life. And I think you said it in so many words that we have forgotten how to be in the food chain. We have taken ourselves out of the food chain, is how I like to say it. And I think this reminds us that we have to participate with life in full, and giving ourselves back to the world that has been so generous to us is so beautifully stated in the poem. In death, please put yourself back eloquently back into the ground to feed the earth in some form, right? So I think it's just so important to keep iterating that, how we have to participate with the world in some form and not take ourselves out of the process, but really participate. So,
right.
Yeah, that's that's a wonderful way to put it. We have worked really hard to take ourselves out of the food chain, but it can't be done. It doesn't work.
No. Yeah. Yeah.
And another thing I noted too is we talk a lot about oral tradition, and we talk a lot about storytelling. And what I noticed most, it gives me chills thinking about it, is how you just read that poem. Your quality of voice, the pace, the meter, your tones, all of these textures that came through as you're reading that poem. How important is that? Because that's part of how we live, as we create vibration in the world. And you just did that with astounding beauty for us.
For me,
Well, I'll tell you, my voice sounds to me like a really old, worn-out musical instrument. An oboe with cracks in it, or an out-of-tune piano. But it's the voice I've got, so it'll have to do.
Mm-hmm.
For me, Robert, it sounded like you and the poem are one organism. You're together. You've worked with the poem. You've lived with the poem. The poem has worked with you, and lived with you for a long time, and that's what I appreciate with that reading that you did. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
This is something I work with both with myself, as I'm a rank beginner at this storytelling game. I've only been at it for 10 years or so. And with other people talking about it, it's like you really, in my sense, you really need to invest your whole being into what's being invited into the room. And I thought eloquently done. Like you talked about being old and out of tune, and I was thinking more like Stradivarius or some of these finely crafted instruments that have survived however long they survived. And it's like, however you think of yourself, it's beautiful. And I'll just leave it at that.
Well, a Stradivarius without a luthier to take care of it would sound pretty awful. It takes a
storyteller without the translator.
Stradivarius has a full-time position like Joe Biden to keep it in good shape.
Here we go. Robert, do you have more to offer? Anything that's weighing on you you'd like to share with us?
Well, we could talk forever, but this has been a very pleasant conversation. I've enjoyed it. Thank you all very much.
It truly has, and we are so looking forward to seeing you at the October conference, Robert, and to seeing you face to face and to hearing more from you.
Exactly, and I think this notion of breathing life into how we come together is something we're all looking forward to in this next 40th anniversary of us men trying desperately to gather together and maintain community. Thank you, Robert. Deeply appreciate your words and what you're inviting us all to. Thank you.
Thank you.